So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Emily. Thanks everybody for joining. I was looking at the chat as people were joining and introducing themselves, and I think we've got people from every continent on the world watching this webinar today, except maybe Antarctica. But apart from that, nearly everywhere in the world, so it's fantastic to be able to speak to you all. And I know that a lot of you will be kind of staying at home right now as well, so hopefully I can kind of fill an hour of your free time for you. As Emily said, most recently I've been working as editor on our Reading Explorer series. So a lot of what I'll talk about today will kind of draw upon that experience, and I'll also be showing some examples from that book as examples as we go through today. Okay, now I'd like to start with just a quick warm-up activity. Later on, when I start the webinar proper, I'm going to talk a little bit about the size of the English language and how English uses words that are picked up from other languages. So I'd like to start with a quick quiz, and what I'd like you to do, please, is to look at the photos that are on the screen, and I want you to think about two questions. Which words or words do they represent, and from which country do the words originate? So these are all words that are used in English but come from other languages. So please type your answers in the chat box. Not 4 picks one word, many different words. So have a look at all the pictures. Yep, somebody's typed rodeo Spanish, so that's a good one to start. Some good answers coming in. I'll just give you 10 seconds or more, but I think, wow, answers are flooding in. Brilliant. I think we've got all the answers there already. Good work. Let me just take you through them. So yeah, first picture, I think a lot of people said this. This is karaoke. Top right picture, there's an omelette. I'm not sure if anybody said ketchup, but there was some ketchup there. Picture in the bottom left, this is a rodeo, of course. And the fourth picture, any late guesses? Yep, we've got vodka. There's one more word in that bottom right picture. So we've got vodka. Anything else? What's she wearing? Coat. Yeah. She's wearing a parka. And she's drinking vodka. Anorak wasn't a bad answer as well. So which languages do these come from? Well, of course, karaoke is from Japanese. Omelette is a French word. Ketchup actually comes from Chinese. Rodeo is a Spanish word. Vodka, of course, is Russian. And I believe that parka isn't actually part of the Russian language, but it comes from an old language that originated in Russian. So any Russian people on the call, you might be able to check that out and double check that I'm right on that. Okay, now let me first of all just give you an overview of what we're going to talk about in the bulk of the webinar. So the focus today, as the title suggests, is building vocabulary through reading. And we're going to touch on other areas of vocab acquisition as we go, but the main focus, as I said, is on reading. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some of the problems that language students face with English vocabulary. We're going to talk about the challenges in English in general, the English language challenges in general. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, the sheer number of words in English and the question of how many words does an English language learner need to know. And we'll also look at what does it mean to know a word. There's more to knowing a word than just knowing its definition. And then the bulk of the webinar, the second part, is going to be about how we, as educators from around the world, how we can help. How can we help our students learn vocabulary in a more efficient way through their reading? We're going to look at 3 main parts. We're going to look at how to encourage reading and also providing texts that are at the right level, which is very important. We're also going to look at how to select and choose appropriate target vocabulary and provide them with opportunities to practice and recycle those words. And we're also, just at the end of the webinar, going to talk a little bit about how we can help students develop their own vocabulary strategies for when they're studying independently. Okay, so as I said, first we're going to talk about the kind of general problems that language learners might face when they're learning English vocabulary. And we're going to start with a quick poll. So Emily, if you could put up the quick poll on the screen, please. So I'd like to get your feedback on this. So we've got a question there. What are some problems that language students face with English vocabulary? You should be able to see the poll, and you should be able to click the options that best match your opinion. So we can see the results coming in there. So what are some problems students face with English vocabulary? Maybe they get confused between similar words. They don't know how to spell words. They don't know which words to study. Forget words soon after learning them. They're not sure how to pronounce words, maybe. Rely too much on using a dictionary. Often use words inappropriately. They find learning words boring. I know that's true in my teaching experience. So I'll just give you, 10, 15 seconds or more to get your answers in. Somebody said all the above. Yep, I can agree with that as well. Okay, and it looks like the results of the poll are in. We can kind of tell, I think the top two answers were there with students get confused between similar words. We'll look at that in a second. That's something we will talk about today. And the fourth point there as well, students forget words soon after learning them. And this is something we'll deal with in a bit of detail towards the end of the webinar today. So great, thank you. Very interesting to hear what your opinions are on that. Now, next, again, just to kind of warm everybody up, I'd like to carry out a short task. So what I'd like you to do, please, is to read through this short passage that's on your screen. And as you read through, I'd like you to pick out any words or phrases that you think might be confusing for students. So I'm not just talking about the low frequency words. I'm also talking about other words that might cause confusion for other reasons. Okay, so which words, as you read through, might be confusing for students? Type in your answers in the chat, which some people are doing already. Al fresco is the first one people have mentioned, yeah. Wow, great that everybody's so involved. These answers are coming in really quickly. There's a few common ones coming in, a lot of al fresco. A few people have mentioned phrasal verbs. Embarrassed, somebody mentioned. It's great. Okay, I'll have to stop you there. There's still some answers coming in, but we'll have to move on. Sorry, let me just go back to that. So let me just go through some of the words that I picked out when I went through this. First of all, the obvious ones are the low frequency words. These are the kind of longer words that we've got there that I picked out there, and with many syllables, and these are always words that are quite difficult to study. Some of them, unintentionally, you could argue that maybe that one's not that difficult. If you knew the root word intent, perhaps that's not actually a difficult word because you can build out from the word parts. But of course, longer words, multiple syllables, these are difficult. A lot of people mentioned phrasal verbs. This is something that, in my teaching experience, I found that a lot of students had problems with this, especially the ones with kind of idiomatic meanings. Run out of is a good one. I think some people mentioned it in the chat. Students will know the word run. Most students will know the word run, but just adding on the preposition out of changes the meaning of that phrasal verb completely. I'm not sure if anybody mentioned these, but there were also a few homonyms in the passage. So homonyms are words with the same spelling or the same sound, but with different meanings. And there were quite a few in the passage there. Main one there was fine. Fine, of course, has multiple meanings. The past tense of fine as a verb is find, and that sounds the same as the verb find, spelled F-I-N-D. Also some words, and a few people mentioned this, and I've seen thoroughly come in, and although a lot of people mentioned these words might be difficult. These words are difficult to learn because they're difficult to pronounce, for one thing. English is a language that's made up of different languages, so a lot of words come from different origins, and therefore, even though they're spelt similarly, they're actually pronounced quite differently. And we won't talk about pronunciation much in this webinar. As I said, we're focusing on reading, but pronunciation is important to know. If you don't recognize the pronunciation of a word, you won't recognize it when you hear it in spoken English. And there's also, of course, there's different variants of English. American English and British English are the most common, and this can get confusing even for native speakers. Good example there is chips and crisps. For me, I'm originally from the UK, so I speak British English. Top left, these are chips for me, and the bottom right, these are crisps. But of course, that's different if you're from America or if you speak American English. Also, English is a language with a lot of synonyms, and again, partly this is because English has a lot of different influences in it from other languages, and so you get words with different origins, and they have the same meaning but very different spelling. So, a good example there at the bottom is fortunately and luckily. Fortunately is a Latin-based word, luckily is a Germanic-based word, and this just adds to the size of the English language. Somebody says they are chips and French fries. I disagree. Chips and crisps. And then we also talked about, I've talked a bit already about how, English borrows words from other languages. And sometimes this can help. If there's a word in English that's similar to a word in your first language, it's very easy to learn. But there are also words, and the four highlighted here, that we call false friends. And they look similar to our first language, but they have a different meaning, and there were a few in the passage. So these were some false friends that were in that passage. We had the word al fresco, which is used in English to kind of mean open air. That's similar, well, it comes from the Italian word al fresco, but in Italian it means in the cool or in jail. In English, we've got the word soap. That's similar to the Spanish word sopa, but sopa in Spanish means soup. In English, we've got the word apology. In French, there's a similar word, apologie, but it has a different meaning in French. It means justification or excuse. And perhaps one that could cause some embarrassment. In English, we've got the word embarrassed. In Spanish, it sounds like the same words, embarazada, but embarazada, apparently, I don't speak Spanish, but apparently it means you're pregnant. Okay, so we've discussed a few of the common challenges when learning vocabulary in English. But another challenge could be knowing, exactly what to study. How many words? A student might ask, how many words should I learn in English? And which words should I learn in English? And of course, every student is different, and it depends on their own personal purpose. But let me talk you through some of the general research into this. We've got some answers coming in there already. 3,000 to 5,000. They're pretty good guesses. Let's see what we get when we get to the end of this slide. Now, in 2010, researchers estimated that there are a total of around 1 million words in English. Now, if you told an English student, that they had to memorize 1 million words, I think they'd give up immediately. I mean, this figure of 1 million, this includes all the archaic words, all the words that are no longer in use. So nobody needs to learn 1 million words. Now, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, there are currently about 200,000 words that are in use at the moment. But again, this is too many. If you start from 0, and if you learn 10 words a day, it would still take you 54 years to learn all these words. And apparently, according to research, most adult native speakers have a vocabulary of around 20,000 to 35,000 words. So already we're breaking this down into a more manageable vocabulary size. So if a student's target is to sound like a native speaker, this is roughly the amount of words they might need to study and learn. But for some students, their aim is not to sound like a native speaker. They might just want to be able to get by in daily conversation. And apparently in daily conversation, most native speakers use only around 2,000 words. And so this is much more manageable. At a rate of 10 words a day, this would only take 200 days to learn. And I've seen a number of people write down 3,000 to 5,000. And this is kind of what a lot of researchers now recommend for an English language student. You aim for a basic vocabulary of 3,000 word families, or maybe more if you're planning to go on to academic study. But I think these figures are good. It's useful for us to know as educators, but it's useful to share them with students as well, so they don't know they have to study a million words. They can break it down into more manageable chunks. I think students need a trillion of words. Yeah, if only that were possible. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, there's a bit more to knowing a word than just recognizing it when you read. When we're talking about learning vocabulary, it's not just about memorizing words and definitions. There's actually a lot more to know about this, and there's a lot more that you can know. You can take one word, and there are a lot of different things that you can know about it. And a few people are typing some ideas in there already, but yeah, let me just take you through what we thought about this. So of course, with the word conclude, first of all, you have to be able to recognize the spelling of the word. You also need to be able to recognize the sound of the word when you hear it. You need to know the meaning, of course, and if it's got two meanings, you need to know those. It's important to know grammatical forms like a past tense. It's helpful to know the word family. So if you know the word conclude, it's good to be able to extend this, take that verb form, turn it into a noun, turn it into an adjective, conclusive, and turn it into an adverb, conclusively. Collocations, a few people have mentioned collocations. I can see that in the chat. Collocations, if you don't know, these are words that kind of naturally group together in English. So the adverb ultimately is one that collocates with the word conclude. Register is important. It's important to know whether a word is formal or informal so that you can use it in the right situations. Frequency is also something that you can learn about a word. For example, the word conclude. This is quite a common word in English, and it appears on academic word lists, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. Knowledge of a word might also include knowledge of its synonyms, similar words, or its antonyms, opposite words. And kind of getting into a bit more advanced knowledge, it's also sometimes useful to know exactly where a word comes from, its etymology. So for example, the word conclude is from Latin origin, and you can break it down into two parts: con, which means completely, and clude, which means closed. And knowledge of these word parts can help you with kind of vocabulary study when you look at different words. And again, this is something we'll come back to a bit later on today. Yeah, and that slide is kind of ordered. We start at the top, just knowing the form and the meaning. This is just the basic knowledge of a word, and eventually you learn more and more about a word and get more advanced knowledge. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of move on to the main part of this webinar, which is how we, as educators, can help. And as I mentioned before, there's three main parts to this. We're going to start by looking at the importance of encouraging reading, and especially providing text at the right level. I'll then move on and just talk a little bit about how to choose the right target vocabulary for the students, and then providing activities to practice them and recycle them. And then the third thing we'll talk about is how to help students develop their own personal strategies. So the first thing that we can do is to encourage reading. And I think most people would agree that reading is one of the best ways that you can build your vocabulary in any language. There were a lot of studies done in the 90s into this topic, and unsurprisingly, they found that students can make great gains in vocabulary both from intensive and extensive reading. These are some of the most famous studies. And these are the ones that are commonly cited in a lot of research. And all this makes sense. If you wanted to learn the most common 2,000 words in English, those most common words are going to recycle a lot in reading passages, and students will encounter them many, many times. Having said that, you can't just read anything. This is a quote from Stephen Krashen, who's one of the main experts in this field. Let me just read the quote to you. So he said, "The best methods for language acquisition are those that supply comprehensible input in low anxiety situations containing messages that students really want to hear." And I think the key phrase there is comprehensible input. And what does that mean? Well, comprehensible input basically means language that can be understood by a learner. And that doesn't mean every single word in terms of a reading passage. If a student reads a passage and they can understand every single word in there, they won't learn anything, of course. But they need to understand kind of 90 to 95% of it. And then hopefully the remaining 5 to 10% they can guess and hopefully learn. So when you're choosing text, and from my point of view, when we're creating text, it's important that we think about this idea of comprehensible input, and that's what we strive to provide students with. So how do you do that? Well, let me give you a few examples. When we're creating text and reading passages for our series Reading Explorer, these are the things that we mainly look at. So you can adapt the length of sentences, individual sentences in a reading passage. You can, of course, adapt the passage length as a whole. You can take away complex grammar structures. You can, of course, grade the vocabulary, and we'll look at how to do that in detail in a minute. And you should also kind of make sure you don't choose overly complex topics. But one thing to consider as you're doing that is to try not to oversimplify things. We don't want to simplify the message to students so that they kind of lose out on the interesting things that are there. So I'll give you an example, a bit of a case study from a reading passage that we included in our series Reading Explorer. In that book we had a reading passage on an octopus. There's an octopus there. And as with many readings for that series, our starting point is a National Geographic article. So of course a passage like this, you can see, is quite long. A passage like this would not be comprehensible input for many learners, especially those who are just starting out learning English. And here's the original opening paragraph from that article that I've just shown you. I'll just give you 10 seconds or so just to skim through it, but as you read through that, I'm sure you'll notice that this is quite a complex paragraph. Now these were the red sections I've highlighted. These were just the ones that struck me as being particularly complex. But there are a lot of words there that would be very difficult for a language learner. But we don't need to just rely on our intuition when we're kind of grading a reading passage. There are tools available to us as well. Now one tool that you can use, and this is one tool that we use when we're grading reading passages, is this website called Text Inspector. It's very useful. The URL's at the top of the page there, and it's a free to use resource. And what you can do with this website is to paste in a chunk of text, and it will analyze that text for you, and it will break down each word and show you the CEFR level of each word. And the results that are on the screen there, these are the results from the original National Geographic octopus paragraph that I just showed you a second ago. Now you can see that most of the words there are A1 to B2 level, or A1 to B1 level, sorry. And you'd kind of expect this from any reading passage because these are the most common words in English. But also in that passage there are a lot of words that were graded B2 and above, B2, C1, C2, and some that are even off the list. And it's these words that would make that text not comprehensible for a student, especially a B1 level student. So this is a really fantastic website. And you can look in detail exactly at what these words are. So it will pick out what the B2 words were, what the C1 words were, what the C2 words were, and what the unlisted words were as well. And knowing this is really useful when you're grading the passage. And also when selecting target vocabulary, which we'll look at a bit later on. So here's the final article that appeared in Reading Explorer. First thing you'll notice is that the length is much shorter, so the overall length of the passage we've reduced. Here's that final paragraph. So this is the final paragraph that appeared in Reading Explorer. So you can see the paragraph is shorter, the sentences are shorter, the vocabulary is much more simple now, and hopefully this will form comprehensible input for a student of this level. And maybe the student won't understand every single word, but that's okay, as long as they can get the main ideas and they can work out the meaning of the unknown words from context. And we can put this adapted paragraph back into Text Inspector, and this is the result we get. So you can see here, now we have very few B2 and above level words. In fact, there's only there's 2 B2 words, 1 C1 word, and 1 C2 word. So it's worked out pretty well. But in addition to kind of looking at the vocabulary and simplifying the vocabulary, there are other ways as well that we can make sure this reading paragraph really is comprehensible input. So for example, if there are subject-specific low-frequency words that we can't remove from the paragraph, we need to keep them in just because the topic kind of insists on it, then there are other things we can do. We can, of course, pre-teach certain words, so words that we think students might have trouble with, but not target vocabulary, we can pre-teach these. We can give clues in captions. You can also provide footnotes with very simple definitions. And visual clues as well are always useful. And as I said, this is all aimed at making as much of that text comprehensible to the student as possible. Okay, so that's the first step. So the first step is to encourage reading and provide text which form comprehensible input. And the next thing we need to do is to help students choose exactly which words they should be studying, and then provide them with the opportunities to practice and recycle those words. Now, when you're choosing target vocabulary, you can use a text analyzer like Vocabulary Profile that we've just looked at. You can also use word lists like academic word lists, and you can also use English corpora. Now we'll talk about 2 and 3 a little bit later on, but obviously Text Inspector, the tool we've just looked at, is fantastic for choosing target vocabulary. This is that octopus passage again. The target vocabulary is highlighted in red, and these are the words that we're expecting students to remember. These are the words that we're going to have them practice, and these are the words that are going to be on their final test at the end of the term. And almost all of the target words in this reading passage are B1 level words, which is just right for students at this level. It's just above their average CEFR level. Yep, someone's asking to show the links again. They're going to come up on a few slides later. You'll get these slides at the end of the webinar as well. And this slide just shows you how we kind of how the target vocabulary progresses through that series of Reading Explorer. So you can see how in our lowest level, the lowest level of Reading Explorer is there on the left, Foundations level. And you can see how there we target A2 and B1 level target vocabulary. By the time you get up to level 5, we're targeting mainly C1, C2 level words. So we start with the core vocabulary, the simplest, most common words in English, and then move up to the less frequent words in the high levels. Okay, now I mentioned that we can also use word lists, like the academic word list as well. An academic word list is a list of words that are common in academia. So you can use lists like this to prioritize certain words. If your students are hoping to go on to academic study, you can pick out words from the academic word list and have students prioritize these words above other ones. And the link I've given you there, this website LexTutor, is a good tool to search the Coxhead academic word list. And let me just show you an example. So this is the home page, and it's a bit like Text Inspector. You paste in the text into that window there, and then you'd click Submit Window, and your results look a little like this. So it's slightly different. So this time this website will break down the words into 1K types. 1K types are the 1,000 most frequent words in English. 2K types, which are the 2,000 most common words in English. And it will also pick up the academic word list types. And in the paragraph that we put in here, we had the word survive. So like I said, if academic study is important to your students, you can prioritize words according to an academic word list. And we did this in Reading Explorer. So if we have a choice, for example, between two B1 words as target vocabulary, we usually choose the one that is on the academic word list. Okay, so we've chosen target vocabulary. The next step, of course, is to practice the vocabulary and to recycle it. We're going to look mainly at how to do this in lesson time, lesson-based practice. Now, this vocabulary page, this comes in Reading Explorer. This comes after the reading passage. Now, I know that in other course books, sometimes you might have the main target vocabulary practice before the reading passage. And, that's a perfectly fine approach. And I've met teachers who've used Reading Explorer and they've actually done the vocabulary page before they do the reading passage. So like I said, that's absolutely fine. Personally, I prefer that students encounter the words for the first time in the reading passage itself. Rationale behind this is that perhaps that's more like the way that you read naturally. In your first language, nobody will pre-teach you a word before you read a book, for example. And also it promotes a key vocabulary skill, which is guessing the meaning of words from context. But like I said, if it works best for your class to pre-teach the vocabulary before you do the reading, I don't think there are any great problems with that. Now, yeah, there are four kind of task types that I'll take you through in a minute for vocabulary practice. We have completion tasks, definition tasks, wording context tasks, and extension tasks. And in Reading Explorer, this is how we kind of imagine that these tasks would be carried out in class. This is our kind of suggested methodology. And again, this is just suggested. So we don't actually expect students to check the target vocabulary in their dictionaries as they read the reading passage. And we also don't expect them to use their dictionaries as they complete these kind of activities in their textbooks. It should hopefully be possible for students to complete all these kinds of activities by simply guessing the meanings of the words from context in the reading. So that's the first step. Students should look back at that reading passage, find the words, guess their meaning. Then they can move on to completing these activities and then perhaps use a dictionary when they want to check their answers at the end. But like I said, do what works for your students and do what works for your class. Okay, so quickly, I'll just take you through a few of these different task types for vocabulary practice. First is a completion task that we have here, and the aim here is to provide practice with the target vocabulary in another context. Now, as mentioned, we're not expecting students to complete this using their dictionaries. We're expecting them to look back at the reading passage, guess from context, get clues as to the part of speech for the word, and then it should be possible to guess which word fills in the gap. So, if you looked at number one here, for example, just looking at that opening sentence, you could probably work out that it's an adjective that needs to go in that gap. And then looking back at the context in the reading passage, they'd probably be able to pick out which of the target vocabulary were also adjectives, and they'd probably get down two options. Maybe they'd get it down to major and extraordinary, and then they should be able to have a good go at getting the right answer. You also might provide simple definition tasks. In this case, you provide the dictionary definition and have students look at the reading passage, guess from context again, and match the words to the definitions. It doesn't always have to be a matching activity. Sometimes you can be completing the definitions using target vocabulary, like this one. And also, it doesn't always need to be a definition either. Sometimes you can just have students choose the correct context for the word to be used in. So, for example, for question 1, it's not a definition, but if you know the meaning of the word distance, you know that the correct answer to that would be kilometers. So they were just kind of a few basic activity types, but I did mention earlier how there's more to vocabulary learning than just knowing a word and just knowing the definition of a word. And it's important that we recognize this, and as educators, we need to extend vocabulary teaching beyond just the focus on words and definitions. So in a series like Reading Explorer, we provide extension tasks that go beyond just the basic meaning of a word, and we do it in a number of ways. One of these ways, and it's something somebody mentioned earlier in the chat room, one of these ways is by introducing students to collocations. So a collocation, there's a good definition there. A collocation is a word or phrase that's often used with another word or phrase in a way that sounds correct to people who've spoken the language all their lives. So they're words that naturally come together in a language, and they're not always intuitive to a language learner. So we need to provide help. Now we can use our intuition, but also there are tools that we can use as well to help us know what these collocations are. And we've talked about using vocabulary profilers like Text Inspector, and we've talked about academic word lists. But there are also English corpora, a fantastic tool, and especially good for collocations. And the one that I use regularly is this one, which is the Corpus for Contemporary American English, which is COCA for short. So okay, let's take an example. We'll look at that corpus in a second and see how that can help with collocations, but let's just start with an example. Suppose we're teaching the adjective severe, as we do in level 2 of Reading Explorer. Severe means very bad or very serious, but you'd never talk about a severe day or a severe person. Those words don't collocate. So it's good to provide words that do collocate so students know how to use them. Now I'll show how to use COCA in a minute, but before I do, and I can see the answers already coming in the chat, before I do, I wanted to test your intuition. What nouns collocate with severe? So severe what? Type your answers in the chat. There's a few good ones coming through, and let's see if we can get the most common ones that are going to appear on the corpus later. So I can just about track. We've got pain. Saw some on weather. I can't really read quickly enough, but I can definitely see some of the answers that were going to come up later in the chat there. Okay, let's have a look. So let's see what the corpus says and see how accurate your guesses were. So this is the COCA homepage. The URL's there as well. It's a fantastic website. There's so much you can learn from this about individual words. It provides so much information. For now, we're just going to look at how to use this site to get collocations, but we'll return to it later. So if you're searching for collocations, you need to search under word, if you see the title there. So you click word, and then you type in the word in the box, and you click see detailed info for word. And then you're presented with this page, which has a wealth of information there about just one word. Lots of this stuff is useful, and we'll talk about some of it later on. But for now, let's just look at the collocations. So there they are. Let's zoom in. So these apparently are the most common collocations with the word severe. So we've got severe problem, severe weather, severe pain, severe case, severe injury, severe disability, severe damage, severe illness. So these are like the top 8 that appear in the corpus, and this is a fantastic tool. I think this covered most of the ones that we had in the chat box down there. And so you can use this kind of information to inform any activities. And this is from Read and Explore, an activity we had testing collocations with severe, and we've got the top ones there. Headache, injury, problem, and weather. And there's other activities that we provide as well. I mean, this one is looking at collocations with the adjective distinctive, distinctive feature, distinctive pattern, smell, sound. And this one's looking at collocations with the adjective, with the adjective negative. Okay, so that's one way to provide extra vocabulary knowledge, by providing collocations. Another way is by looking at word families. We talked a little about this before, so you can extend your knowledge of one word to 2 or 3 more with quite little effort if you can teach some word families. So let's look at that same word, severe. And often word families are presented in a table like this one. So severe is an adjective, there's no verb form. The noun is severity, and the adverb is severely. So just knowing that one word, severe, you can extend that knowledge to 2 other words pretty easily enough. Here's another example. I mean, this is a good one. You take the word honest. You extend that knowledge of the word honest to 5 other words just by adding on different word parts, changing to adverbs, adjectives, adding a prefix to give the negative. And you can also focus on word parts that change, for example, change verbs to nouns. So the suffix tion is one that's useful for students to know because it will turn a lot of verbs into nouns. Okay, so collocations, word families. Another way to provide a kind of extended vocabulary task is to look at an individual word and break that one down into its parts. In doing this, you can provide links to other words. So for example, if you took the word ensure, now you can break ensure down into 2 parts and focus on that prefix n. So that prefix n is very useful and very common for turning adjectives into verbs. Can anybody think of any other common ones? So we've got ensure there. Perhaps in the chat you can type in some other common words that begin with en. Encourage is a good one. Enable, entitle. Yeah, so there's so many words. So if a student's reading and they come across any of these words that you're typing in here, if they know what n means, in most cases here they'll know that second word. Endanger is another good one. They'll know what danger means. They'll know that the n turns that word into a verb to make danger. Yeah, lots of great ideas. And again, you can provide activities on that. You can take that word ensure, teach the meaning of the prefix, and here we just taught enable, enlarge, and enrich. And again, you can use a corpus to pick out the most common ones. Okay, so collocations, word families, word parts. Another final extension task could be to provide practice with synonyms. So you can provide a link in this way to study other words. So for example, if you were learning the word fantastic, you might want to provide your students with synonyms for this. One synonym is wonderful. Somebody has already written awesome, fantastic, amazing, superb. Yep, some great ideas. So maybe Emily, if you took a screen grab of the page now, this could be our feedback on the webinar already done. One thing to mention about synonyms, of course, you know, for if your students were, how do I say it? If your students studying 10 words, for example, you don't want to give them 5 synonyms for every word that they study because you're going to end up with them studying 50 words. So, you know, use your own common sense. Maybe just pick out, if they're studying 10 words, just pick on one of them like fantastic that has a lot of common synonyms and focus on that one. Okay, now the last thing I'd like to mention just on this topic of vocabulary practice is recycling and repetition, and there's 2 main aspects to this. The first aspect is that studies suggest that a learner needs to encounter a word at least 7 times before it's kind of committed to their vocabulary. I know there's some studies that might say more than that, but Minimum figure is 7 times. And the other key thing to kind of focus on is that distributed practice is important. So by distributed practice, we mean testing and recycling vocabulary over a sequence of lessons at spaced intervals. So for example, it's not enough to practice a word 7 times in one class. Those 7 encounters with that word, it needs to be spaced out over a sequence of lessons, over a period of weeks, and maybe a period of months for it to be truly effectively acquired. Now, in terms of recycling vocabulary, I talked earlier on about how reading is such a great tool for this very reason. If you think about it, in reading, the most common useful words in English are going to be recycled naturally over and over again every time you read a passage, every time you read an article, every time you study a textbook reading like this one. So let's just take an example from Reading Explorer. So we had the target vocabulary continue. This was in Unit 5 of this book. And let's just look at how this word naturally recycles throughout this one course book. It actually appears twice in that same reading passage. It comes up in Unit 6, again in Unit 8, and again in Unit 9. After a few encounters, students will also start to notice things like collocations or certain grammatical structures. So for example, here they might start to notice that continue is often followed by to plus a verb. Here again, there's to plus the verb, continue to melt. Here's a fixed phrase, a strong collocation there, to continue in this way. So again, students might start picking up on these phrases as this word is recycled. Another example there with the infinitive. And another as well. And so that's why reading is so good for vocabulary acquisition. Words like that, they'll just recycle over and over again without people even knowing it. And the words that recycle most, they're the ones that are the most useful to know. Okay, a lot of people are typing blank. Can't see anything. Can you still hear me? Okay, let's just see if we can get those slides back. Yep, okay, looks like it's back now. It was just the same slides that I'd showed you a few minutes earlier anyway. Okay, so vocabulary we recycle naturally if students continue to read, but it's also important to provide more controlled practice and more opportunities to encounter words. So in a series like Reading Explorer, we also provide a lot of extra vocabulary practice outside the student book itself. I'll just give you a few examples. We have a quiz, a vocabulary quiz on the classroom presentation tool. This is the kind of thing you can project to your class. If you're doing an online class, this would be useful as well. We have online practice with vocabulary activities on there. So again, maybe this could be used as homework or for an online class. And here's an activity. This is from the online practice. And again, we've got that word continue being recycled again. Vocabulary is also recycled on test materials. Continue again. This is our exam view component. And we also provide vocabulary crosswords on our companion website. And again, these will help you review the target words from the student book. And there's continue again. So again, this could be something provided as homework, or it could be done in class as a warm-up activity maybe. And finally, we're obviously focusing in this webinar on reading, but of course, using language, using new words in spoken English is also important when you need to remember it. There's that common phrase, use it or lose it. And we do have communicative activities as well online vocabulary games like this, for example, where students need to describe the target vocabulary without saying the words listed on the card. So yeah, spoken communicative vocabulary games are again a useful way to kind of reinforce vocabulary practice. Okay, now finally, I mentioned earlier about how important recycling at spaced intervals is. So I thought I'd just give you a quick example of how this might work in practice. Now the timings here are just a suggestion, but hopefully this will give you just a little bit of an idea before we finish about this idea of spaced intervals. So for example, the first encounter with a word might be in the student book reading passage. Perhaps 30 minutes later, that word appears again in class, this time in the student book vocabulary activity. Maybe 3 hours later, for homework, the student does online practice and encounters that word a third time. Fourth encounter with the word could be in class 3 days later, on the classroom presentation tool end of unit quiz. Perhaps there's a fifth encounter with that word. If the teacher is very organized and they want to review the previous week's vocabulary, they might provide a vocabulary crossword. 2 weeks after that, maybe the student does some self-study of their own. They look back at their notes. And then 1 month later, perhaps there's a class test using ExamView. And remember that all the time while this is happening, there's also natural recycling going on in different reading passages and in daily conversation as well. Okay, now the final section that I'd like to talk about as well, and this is perhaps one of the most important ones. We talked about a lot about kind of studying vocabulary in class, but just to finish, I'd like to talk about some strategies that students can use when they're reading independently. So, first thing, and perhaps the most important tip that we can give is that students should read something interesting and that's at the right level for them. And we touched on this earlier. If possible, we suggest that students don't stop reading when they find an unknown word. We suggest they guess the meaning and move on. They can use the context and their knowledge of word parts. We also suggest students annotate the text as they read. They underline the unknown vocab, they put a question mark in the margin, and then later they can return to these words to check any unknown vocabulary, this time using their dictionary. Now, if necessary, they can also use a corpus to check how common each word is, and I'll just give you a quick example of this. So imagine a student finds a new word, and they want to know whether this is a word that they should study or not, one of them that they should memorize. So they can use a corpus. Imagine they find the word conclude. They can enter it into the corpus, and they can find that conclude is actually the 1972nd most common word in English. It's in the top 2000. So this is one that they should be studying. Compare that with this word. Imagine a student finds the word dereliction in a reading passage. They can put it into the corpus. They can see that this is the 27,000th. It's not even in the top 20,000 words in English, so this is one that perhaps they don't worry about studying. And also on the corpus, we talked a bit about this before. There's a lot of information there. You have a graph that shows you where the word appears most common. This one, conclude, appears very often in academic English. And you can also use the corpus to find the collocations, as we saw earlier, and synonyms. And synonyms and collocations are also great to record in a vocabulary diary, which is our 6th tip. Now, a vocabulary diary could just be a simple list of words like this one, but it's also possible to do something a bit more elaborate. So you can have students record the word, definitions, translations, example sentences. They could use the corpus then to fill in synonyms and collocations. And even a visual would be good to help remember some of the words. And this kind of activity would form a nice part of a student's homework maybe. And then our final tip is for students to review that diary, test themselves at regular intervals rather, using memorization techniques. So they could cover up the information on the vocabulary diary and try and remember the word. Okay, and just very, very finally and very quickly, because we're running out of time, ebooks are also a good way for vocabulary study while you're reading. So if you're using an ebook, you can highlight a word, you can make a note, and your notes against that word will be saved in the ebook. You can also create flashcards using ebooks. You highlight the word, choose create flashcard, and then you're presented with a screen like this. You can write your clue on the back of the card, and then you can practice the flashcards by clicking the play icon there. You can test yourself, so you'll see the clue. You turn over the card to see if you're right or wrong. You click I know it or I don't know it. And if you click I don't know it, that will turn red in your flashcard deck. And next time you practice, it will focus, the software will focus on the words that you didn't know. So ebooks as well are a great tool for vocabulary study, especially while reading. Okay, that's all. I'll just put the recap on the screen there. We don't have that much time left, but yep, thank you all. Thank you all for attending. It's been great. You've been very thanks for the participation and the nice comments in the box down there. And I think I can hand back over to Emily.
Thanks so much, Chris, for the wonderful session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for an hour. It was a great session, and just so everyone knows, I know there were a lot of questions about getting the slides and all of the really helpful links. We'll be sending those to you, so you all will get a copy of the slides and the recording from the session, as well as a certificate for attending with us today, or for joining us today. So thanks, everyone, for being here. We're really glad you could join us. Just a few notes as we wrap up. Many of the examples Chris showed today were from the 3rd edition of Reading Explorer. Have the slide up on the screen right now. It's a 6-level series. To learn more, you can visit the link on the site. I'm just going to, the link on the slide. I'm going to put it in the chat box right now too. eltngl.com/Reading Explorer 3E to learn a little bit more about that. Or you can always contact your National Geographic Learning representative too. Great. And just as we wrap up here, I do want to let you know we have several upcoming webinars to help you with your transition to teaching online. I'm going to put another link in the chat box now. You can register for those on our webinar site, and you can also view the full archive of previous webinar recordings and slides there too. So be sure to check those out if you have a chance. And we are constantly updating our digital resources page to support teachers as you transition to teaching virtually. And we'll have new webinars here, training videos, blog posts, and other free professional development resources to help you with that transition. So I'm going to put just one more link in the chat box now. Great. And so you can expect those slides in the next 3 to 5 business days, along with the recording too and the certificate. But thanks all for being here. And we just invite you to connect with our online community. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, WeChat if you're in China. So be sure to connect with us. Thank you all for being here today. And I just saw a comment about the first link I mentioned. We'll send that along in the follow-up email too, so you'll get it there as well. I know the chat box is moving really quickly. But thank you all for spending an hour with us, and thank you, Chris.
Yep, thank you everybody.
All right,
Thanks,
you'll all
Emily.
be redirected to a feedback survey now. We'd love to hear what you thought. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye now.
Bye.